Good morning. We're just, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending where in the world you are today. We're just leaving a few seconds to let people come into the room and get settled. It would be really good if at this stage, because of the volume of people attending the webinar, if you don't mind turning off your screen, that would be great. I think everybody is on mute. Please do use the normal conventions of Zoom to put your name into the chat, introduce yourself, tell us where you are in the world, what the weather's like, and generally start that networking bit. We'll be using the chat as a way of sharing questions and ideas throughout the webinar. Just give it a few minutes to let a few seconds more for people to come in, as I can see the numbers increasing in front of my eyes, which is gratifying. Okay, so let's make a start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody taking part in this first International Think Tank webinar brought to you by the International Career Development Peak Body Network. That's quite a mouthful with lots of internationals in, but I'll explain a little bit about who we are and what we're hoping to do. My name is Jan Ellis. I'm a member of the UK professional body for people working in career development, which is called the Career Development Institute. And I'm delighted to be chairing this first session today. As I said a little bit earlier, in terms of webinar etiquette, because we're expecting a lot of people on this session, grateful if you could keep your cameras off, at least initially. Please do use the web chat to talk to colleagues, tell us where in the world you are, and use also the chat for sharing any questions that you might have of our speakers. And we've had a little practice this morning, so I will add the point about time delay, that sometimes there is a slight time delay between speakers loading up their slides in between sessions. But anyway, let's move on quickly and talk a little bit about who the International Career Development Peak Body is. So next slide, please, Dan. Thank you. The International Peak Body started to come together last May. It was the time of the first COVID lockdown, and the lead was actually taken by Australia, by the Career Industry Council in Australia, which is a peak body, the overarching body for professional development in an institute sense in Australia. And they invited a number of other Commonwealth English-speaking countries to meet together on Zoom. And at that time, I was delighted to represent the UK body on that group. And initially we came together, it was the first major lockdown of the great pandemic that we've all been suffering over the past 18 months. And we came together really to share ideas, to talk about how our countries were managing the COVID pandemic, but very much from a perspective of career development and how it was impacting on our citizens, and importantly, career development policy. So the members of the group, you can see the logos at the bottom of the slide, and this is just so far that we're very open to more countries joining us. But Australia, there you can see by the logo, the UK, excuse me, the Canadian Career Development Foundation, New Zealand, and the South African Career Development Association. So those are the professional bodies represented by this overarching peak body. And the focus, as I said, was that we came together to talk about how we could support each other, what our communities were doing in the light of the pandemic, how it was impacting on career development professionals. And we came up with the idea that it would be very nice if we could do more to share good practice with colleagues working in our countries. And that's how the International Think Tank webinar series was actually born. Next slide, please, Dan. So We planned initially to offer 5 webinars, and that's our plan going forward. So the idea is that we're inviting career thought leaders from around the world to contribute to the debate that will inform all career development professionals about our developing roles in a post-COVID world. The series initially has got up to 5 topics, and you can see them listed there. Today is the first one, where we're focusing on who we are as a profession, the history of career development, a bit about our professional identity, and finishing with discussion around the importance of professional development and training for our sector. The second webinar, which we hope we'll be putting on in 3 or 4 months' time, will focus on theory and practice, and a different nation will take the opportunity to lead that. So it might be that you're on the receiving end of a recorded version of the webinar rather than taking part if the hours really don't work out for you from an international perspective. The third session we'll be doing will focus on policy and the whole political climate. The fourth on equality, diversity and inclusion. And we'll finish this first series, and I say first series because we've got ideas to do more, looking at social justice and advocacy. And the format, as you've seen from our first email, is that we'll be inviting at least 3 speakers to each of these sessions to present on these topics. And I'm delighted that we're starting the first webinar with 3 really big hitters. These are people known as career leaders, career thought leaders in our sector. Dr. Mary McMahon, Associate Professor from the University of Queensland School of Education in Australia. Dr. Siobhan Neary, who is Associate Professor and Head of the International Centre for Guidance Studies at the University of Derby in the UK. And finishing with Dr. Spencer Niles, who's Professor and Dean Emeritus at the School of Education at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in the States. So really 3 big, great speakers today. And without more ado, because I don't want to take up their time, I'm going to invite Dr. Mary McMahon from the University of Queensland to start our presentation today with a focus on the history of the career development profession. Mary, lovely to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan, and thanks for the opportunity to present here today. It's exciting to be part of a new webinar series and also to be part of the first webinar. So my focus tonight is on just the overall idea of professionalising career development and what we can learn from our history that will enable us to strengthen our future. So my presentation today is really underpinned by the question, is career development a profession? And so I'll be thinking about the history of career development and looking at how that has progressed over the time to see whether we're moving in the direction of becoming a profession. So I think to begin with, it's useful to think about the origins of career development in relation to where we are today. And there are 3 interrelated factors that I'd like to talk about. One is from the very beginnings of career development or career guidance, and that's one of the issues in our field, what we call ourselves. So in Australia, we use the terms career guidance and career development. I know in Europe and the UK, career guidance is probably the dominant sort of term, and in Canada and the US, career development. So with whatever you call our profession, the original underpinnings of it was in the social reform movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And that was a period of rapid societal transformation, I guess similar to what we're in now, during the Industrial Revolution, when big numbers of people had been displaced and disenfranchised as a result of the move from an predominantly agrarian society to an industrial society, and with migration occurring also at the time. And so social reformers of the time decided that they would like to help disenfranchised people find work and find their place so they could help them towards a better future by finding work for them. So people came into the field from a range of different professions, and some were philanthropists, some were from other fields, but all trying to help disenfranchised people. And another sort of historical part about career development that I think is important is that once the field started to show what it could do, policymakers became interested in the field because they saw that career development could potentially help them with their labour market goals and their social inclusion policies. And so they began to develop programs, and in the UK they developed a bureau to help families and young people to try to keep young people at school longer, so their prospects when they left school were better than if they left school early. So there was a very early link between career guidance or career development, whatever we call it, and policy. And so in 1998, Tony Watts called career guidance a soft policy instrument, and that term subsequently been used by Tristram Hooley and his colleagues because policymakers recognised a link between what the sort of work that our field does and their social inclusion, educational and labour market policy agendas. And that has had implications for our field throughout time because, as we know, when governments are elected, re-elected or whatever, things are in favour, things are out of favour. So funding comes, funding goes, policies come, policies go, and programs come and go as well as a result of that. So underpinning our field from the very beginning was the value of social justice, because it was, our field emanated out of the social reform movement and social justice was at its heart, and it's always remained at our heart. And that means that people coming into our field came from related professions. So we have people coming into our field from social work, psychology, education. All of those people have skills that and knowledge that is relevant in part, but not entirely. Another issue to do with our history is that it's a primarily Western history, primarily from the US and Europe, and it's been sort of exported and imported into other countries and cultures around the world. And so non-Western countries are beginning to come on board with career development, but an issue for them, I think, is whether career development as we know it in terms of its theory, its practices, its history, actually is a good fit for them, or whether it needs to be adjusted, adapted to be fit for purpose. So that's some historical factors that I think help us understand the position that we're at today. So basically, for probably almost the first 100 years of its history, people just came into the field and worked in the field to help people find work, guide students in the transition from school, etc. And things came to a head in the early 2000s, in 2004, when the OECD did a review of career guidance in countries around the world, and ultimately about 37 countries were reviewed. But they found that career guidance was weakly professionalised, and that in most countries there was insufficient training or inappropriate training, and that really presented barriers for governments who were looking to career development to implement lifelong learning and labour market policies. So that was a kind of a wake-up call, I guess, for the field, who had pretty much drifted along in the way it had always been. So what was it that the international review wasn't seeing in our field? Well, if we think about what a profession is, basically, according to Professions Australia, it's a disciplined group of individuals who have specific skills and knowledge, who've been trained in that area, who have ethical standards. It's a field that's accepted by the public. It's got an evidence base of research, and the practitioners are trained at a high level, and that they exercise that skills and knowledge to assist people. So basically the OECD was saying, well, we're not really seeing that in career development. So what they thought was missing then, if we think about the elements of a profession and take that definition a little bit further, and this goes right back to the work of Greenwood in 1957, but basically elements of a profession is a systematic body of theory or knowledge, which we know that we've got, authority and credibility, which I'm not entirely sure we have really got yet, recognition of community sanction or regulation of its members. We've got some of that happening and some of it's sort of in the pipeline, codes of ethics and a professional culture. So basically our field had to move towards getting more of those sorts of things incorporated. And if we turn to, so our field began to professionalise. So in professionalisation, Professional Standards Council in Australia says there are 5 E's of professionalisation. One is education, where people need formal qualifications to be in the field. Another is ethics, that they need to be working according to an ethical code that protects the public and protects them. And experience, that they come into the field with the capabilities that they need to actually do the work. And that has to be subject to examination, whether there's some sort of assurance process to ensure that all of those 3 things happen. And so if we're going to have that sort of examination and assurance process, we need some entity to oversee it. And that's where a lot of the professional associations that we belong to come in, because I know the CDI in England, the NCDA in the US, CICA in Australia have all brought in professional standards. And in non-Western countries as well, like Vietnam and South Africa, standards are being introduced and implemented. So the way that the field has professionalised is through professional standards, which, depending on where you look in the world, they basically include something about terminology, who belongs in the profession, what ethical code we work by, what are the entry-level qualifications, what are our continuing professional development requirements, and what sort of competencies do we need to work in the field. So most professional standards will cover most of those things. So in essence, what professional standards do is define the industry, they guide entry into the industry, they say what skills and knowledge we need, and in turn that provides a foundation for training. It provides some assurance to the public, and it requires practitioners to have continuing professional development. And so with those things in place, then we can begin to assume that a professional identity is being developed for the field itself and also for the people in the field. And so basically professional identity, and I know Siobhan's going to talk more about this later, but it's how people define themselves in their role, but it's about being connected with professional knowledge, it's about the titles that we use, and it's about the expertise that we hold. And all of those things go to comprise professional identity at the level of the association or the field, and also for the individuals. So we could then say, well, does it matter? Do we need professional standards? Could we get there without professional standards? Well, in 2012 in Australia, the professional standards here were finally introduced. And in 2012, the Career Industry Council did a survey that asked people about the introduction of the professional standards. And basically the answer was a resounding yes, that professional standards did make a difference. And as you can see here, it really impacted. Most of the participants thought it had changed professional identity because there were standards. They felt they belonged to a national profession and they felt that the field had been defined. But it not just applied to professional identity that they thought it was important. They changed professional practice in terms of maintaining PD records, participating in PD. They believed that it would influence service delivery, and although we haven't sort of measured that, we can't measure that to date, you would reasonably assume that if you've got better qualified people doing the work, that the standards would improve. and they thought it was good that the professional standards also guided the training courses for practitioners. So the answer to the question, do professional standards make a difference, was answered with a resounding yes in the Australian context. So I come back to, as I move towards the end of my presentation here, I come back to the question I asked at the beginning: is career development a profession? And I think then we need to think, well, we still got multiple titles in the field. In that survey that I just presented some brief results from, people identified themselves by 20 different terms. And that's very confusing for policymakers. It's very confusing for the general public, and it can be confusing in the field as well, because we don't know who's doing what and what's different between those titles. We still have people in my country coming into the field through other pathways despite the professional standards, because most employing authorities don't require people to be appropriately trained. So the identity of the profession is still shaping. And public acceptance of the profession, I'm not sure that enough of the public still would see us as the first port of call if they lost their job, or if they needed assistance, if they were unhappy at work or whatever. They might turn elsewhere or turn to their network, but I'm not entirely sure that they would turn to us. And in an international research I did some years ago with some colleagues on career development of women, none of the women from 9 different countries had gone to a career guidance practitioner. And as I said before, as it internationalizes in our field, we need to think about whether our Western methods are appropriate in non-Western settings. So to return to my title, Professionalising Career Development, Learning from History and Strengthening the Future, I think we can think about where we are now in terms of where we came from. And we've certainly come a long way, and particularly in about the last 20 years, we've come a very long way. And that foundation that we're building through professional standards is really helping to strengthen our future and our identity as a profession. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I've got a reference list here from where I've sourced that material, and thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Mary. And I am watching the chat, but we'll pick up questions, I think, at the end, because then there'll be a sort of sequence. I think people need to see the whole picture. I'm going to invite next Dr. Siobhan Neary, Associate Professor and Head of the International Guidance Studies in the UK, to take the debate and the discussion through to the next stage, which is a bit more of a focus on professional identity. Siobhan.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm sitting in quite a dull day in the UK. I'm really pleased to be able to follow on from Mary's presentation. I think I'm the jam in the sandwich today. I'm sort of connecting through what Mary has talked about in terms of professionalisation and what Spencer's going to talk about around CPD. So I'm starting with a quote that I often use, and I'll finish with the rest of the quote. But I think this is incredibly important in defining us as a profession, and that is: qualifying is not the point of arrival, but the point of departure. And I think what I want to talk about in the time that I've got with you is looking at how we ensure that it's not just about those initial qualifications. I know that when I did my training 30 odd years ago, I felt that I had a good grounding in my initial training, but I learnt my professional practice from my colleagues, and that was incredibly important. And I think we often underestimate the importance of that whole community that we're part of. So the two things I'm going to look at are sort of developing a professional identity. Mary's already talked a little bit about this, and also I'm going to take on some of the points that Mary's already talked about in terms of professionalisation, and conceptualise those as in what I call 6 steps. I think it's quite interesting. We all end up looking at this in different ways, but I think there is a huge amount of commonality and a systematic approach that we need to think about, regardless of where we are in as a country in this. And I think one of the things that is important in a lot of the research I've been involved with is that countries all go through a similar process in terms of professionalisation of careers practice, and we all come in at different stages, very much directed by the policy context in which we work. And I think that's one of the things that we do need to think about, is the individual context that we as practitioners work in, the evolution of our profession within our particular country, and also how that all connects through in terms of the status and control that we have over the profession that we're involved with, which is something we spend a lot of time talking about. So I will start with my definition of professional identity. There are many out there, and I'm very happy to connect people to others, but I think it's as simple as the concept of how we perceive ourselves within the occupational context that we work in, and how we communicate this to others. And when I've talked to practitioners about this a lot, they've often really struggled to think about having a professional identity, or what it actually means to them. And I think part of the challenge, and Mary's already alluded to this, is around nomenclature and terminology, and the fact that we have multiple terms that we continue to use to name the activities that we're involved in, and to describe the activities that we do. And just in England alone, I did a piece of work with the CDI some years ago, where we analysed job descriptions over a period of a month, and we came up with something like 103 different job titles. Just on a piece of work within higher education careers services over the last couple of months, and again we had, I think we had 25 different job titles being used. And so I think that these differentiations can potentially act as a divide, and we do need to think very carefully and be clear about what we're talking about. So professional identity is something we need to talk more about in the profession, and to understand who we are and what we do, and the messages that we're communicating widely about the work that we do. So moving on, so professional identity is not something that automatically evolves. There are a number of different drivers that contribute and influence. So the work by Obama, what she suggests is that it evolves through socialization and observation of peers. And I think this is particularly interesting, because I think this is one of the things that was hugely influential for me, was learning from my colleagues and observing people and trying on, what their professional identity was like, and testing it out. And I think we don't necessarily always have the opportunity to do that, because I think in England in particular, I think careers work has become quite isolating. So how we see ourselves, how we define the role, and again, I think this is one that can be quite dynamic and very influenced by public policy and what government decide is priority for them, and also expectations of others. And Mary alluded to this in the book, and it is a brilliant book, by the way. I have read it, and I was shocked that the women they spoke with knew very little about the careers opportunities to talk about career and develop career. And I do totally agree with her, because we've been having these debates in England over the last 18 months about where people who are furloughed are going to get help and support. They're not coming to the career service. They're going to lots of other places, mostly the public employment service, because that's where the information is. That's what they know about. So I think there are real issues around the expectations of of a society generally as to who we are and what we do. And I think we have to take some responsibility in driving that forward. For identity also is not static. It is quite dynamic, and engaging in qualifications and skill acquisition is an incredibly important part of that. And we find this, we train careers advisors and career leaders, and you can see how they develop and how they see themselves evolves over the year that they're training with us, and the language and their confidence in the terminology of how they describe things and how they start to see themselves by the end of their practice. So recognizing that training, but also that engagement with other colleagues is really important. So that social construction, that link to community of practice is central to what we do and how we do it. So as I've said already, that external recognition is an important part. And I think, we've done some work looking at how that's evolved in different countries. And it is massively varied. There are some countries where careers provision is highly structured, highly embedded in all of, policy. Scotland's a really good example of that, as is, a lot of the work that's going on in the Nordic countries, in Norway, for example. So what Brown's telling us is that occupational professional identity is forming and reforming regularly based on the drivers that are influencing the practice and what we're involved with. So I'm just going to take some of the concepts that Mary talked about a little bit further and talk a little bit more about initial training as well. And I think that what we don't promote is that we do have a discrete theoretical knowledge. Many of you here today are engaged in research. You'll be perhaps writing about your practice. We have a huge body of literature. We are developing the evidence base continually. We're hoping in the UK to do something that's collecting all of that together. But we don't necessarily promote what we've that there is this discrete knowledge as effectively as we could do. Consistency of practice, as Mary's talked about, the standards, is incredibly important in ensuring that people coming in have the training, skills, the knowledge, the behaviours, the attitudes that we need, and also that we have a diverse workforce. We have a workforce in our country that is very white, very female, very middle-aged, very like me, and that's something we need to think about. We need to do much more to ensure that the clients that we're working with see a workforce that looks like them and reflects them, and their cultural issues and their life experience as well. So quality assurance, again, within this, something we've engaged extensively with through many countries. We're currently in the UK at the moment redeveloping our matrix quality assurance standard for information advice and guidance, and that's going to again be inclusive of the thinking that is shaping careers practice at this moment. I don't want to spend too long on CPD because I know Spencer's going to talk about that, but I do think it's important to think about the CPD is not just about you as the practitioner. It's incredibly important, but it's also about how engaging in CPD benefits your clients, how it enables them to get the best service, the best practice that's available to them. And it's also about the profession, being able to demonstrate we are a profession that is evolving, that we are taking on the evidence, that we are adapting our practice to ensure that we are meeting the needs. The needs of the clients I worked with 30 years ago were very different to the needs of the clients I would be working with today. Continuing professional development builds personal and professional esteem. Really important to ensure that we are developing. And interestingly, research that I've done, practitioners who engaged in CPD saw their colleagues who didn't as not being professionals. And I think that's an important thing to think about. And again, it's the engaging regularly. And I think proactivity in CPD is very important. I think we have a culture quite often of passive engagement where, and again, research I've done has suggested that you know, that if it's not paid for, if I'm not given time to do it within the workplace, then I'm not going to do it. And, you know, I think we have to question whether that is a professional attitude in this day and age. So that might be controversial for some, but I think as all professions, you know, you own your professional practice and what you do to ensure that that is the best it can be. And it should be a partnership between you and your employer, but increasingly many of us are working self-employed. So, you know, that sort of psychological contract is not necessarily there anymore. We also should be looking at recording and reflecting, and also looking at ways of how we can ensure that our work is evolving, and there is evidence of the impact. And communities of practice is hugely important. And again, that's something the Career Development Institute in the UK has worked really hard on. So the professional bodies are a key part of all of this. And I think this, you know, this International Career Development National Peak Body Network is incredibly important. I think the opportunity to bring and share a collective voice is going to help move professionalisation forward much quicker. Being part of the professional body or being registered as a practitioner gives a stronger voice to the sector. It promotes us as a profession. We've got a voice that is at the table, hopefully in policy. It also regulates the profession, so membership of it is important. I think one of the things I would say, and I think this is a real challenge for all of us, is that we can only talk about those colleagues who are engaged in the profession, and not everybody is able to. You know, there are many outside of who are practicing as careers practitioners who aren't members of a professional body, and we need to find ways that we can actually reach out to them and look at new ways of drawing them in, because I suspect a lot of those are working in community groups with very disadvantaged clients, and there isn't the resource necessarily in time and money to engage. So we do need to think that the profession isn't just about those who signed up members. We need to think who else is out there that doesn't have the opportunity to join and be part of our professional bodies. Registration that the professional associations offer, again, is part of that authority of our expertise that we can bring. Mary's already talked a bit about social justice, but I do think that our shared values and ethics are absolutely central to what we do. And when I talk to practitioners about their work, regardless of what part of the sector they work in, they all talk about ethics. And what that does is it does give us a strong core in terms of being able to define what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. I think we need to find ways of communicating that more strongly and more effectively. I think having shared values gives us commonality in terms of our direction of travel. And people coming into this profession want to make a difference and want to help. But we are increasingly challenged by neoliberal agendas, payment by results, targets, funding restrictions. There is a real tension, I think, at the moment between some ethical practice and some of the public funding regimes that we're working within. And those are the things that I would hope this group will be able to talk about and share some strategies for how we manage this. I think research, I would say this, having been a practitioner for many years and evolved into being a researcher, I think is incredibly important. And it always concerns me that practitioners often don't have as strong of an understanding of theory around their work and what they do. And sometimes they come to it a bit later in life. They may have done it as part of their initial training and, you know, as they've moved on. But I do think we do need to find ways of making research much more accessible to practitioners, to find ways of promoting the evidence base, promoting what the impacts are and what works. And this, I think, again, will help build a stronger profession for all of us and a better understanding of what we do and why we do it. I've talked quite a bit about professional identity already, but I think that we do need to ensure that we have a shared articulation of who we are and what we do and who we do it for. I think, as Mary quite rightly said, it is both individual and collective, and we need to look at how we find ways of communicating and sharing effectively. I think a sense of belonging is an incredibly important part of what we're doing. And I think looking at boundary maintenance There are a lot of people involved in parts of careers work, some professionalised, others less so. And I think we do need to be clear about what is our area and why we are the professionalised elements of it. And finally, just to end that quote, it comes from a piece of work by Rachel Mulvey, who is an academic in the UK in IAVG, and this she wrote in one of her papers. But for those who do engage, who do qualify and engage in autonomous professional practice, the realization dawns that qualifying is not the point of arrival, but the point of departure. And that's my message really, is how do we move forward? And hopefully Spencer's going to take us to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. And I think that's a great segue. Because of time, let's move on quickly. Spencer, thank you so much, who's got up at some ungodly hour to be able to meet up with the UK time zone, so we could share this from the UK. But welcome, Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's, let me get my screen here. Let me get this back to where it needs to be. All right. Yeah. So what a privilege to be part of this. Yeah, it's almost 4:45 in the morning here, and I'm in Rome, actually. The bad news, it's Rome, Maine. I'm in the town of Rome in the state of Maine, and it's really a privilege to be part of this initiative. What a brilliant initiative it is, I think, and much needed. And I was just reflecting as Mary and Siobhan were delivering their presentation about how similar the challenges are. They certainly are similar to the challenges that we experience in the United States. And so I thought, as Mary noted, part of our challenge is language, and we are a verbal profession. So it's an important challenge for us to consider. And so I just wanted to focus on this definition that certainly fits in the States, but I'm not so sure how well it might other places. But so we train practitioners to impact the career development of the students and the clients with whom we work. And if you think about this term of career development and all that's involved in the career development process, it's a bit daunting, you know. And I remember I had the privilege of serving on Donald Super's research team for something he called the CDAC model, Career Development Assessment and Counseling Model. And I remember having a conversation with Don when he said, no one theory of career development could possibly do it all, and that we need to take bits and pieces from theories, which I thought was really impressive that Don was acknowledging that. And that's at a time when there were lots of wars going on among career development theorists, but he was very much aware of the fact we need to look at the best from anywhere that we can draw upon to use to help our clients advance in their career development. And just some basics related to that, if it's okay, because I think it has implications for the kind of training we engage in and what's important to stay mindful of. You know, it was not that long ago when there was a bit of a debate, at least in the States, about how personal is career counseling. We use the counseling word quite a bit in the States. And I think it's pretty obvious that it's an essential aspect of human development, that we need to stay linked, career development and human development. And that it certainly connects, I think, to everyone we work with their intersectionality of identities related to culture, related to socioeconomic status, educational level, et cetera. It's an important element of the kind of identities, the kind of considerations that are necessary in helping people look at who they are and who they're becoming relative to their career development. Now, this is an ideal statement. I get it. It does come from Don, but ideally, if in choosing an occupation, we are about the process of implementing what we believe to be true about ourselves. Ideally, when the privilege, when the opportunity is available to us, it could be described in this way. If any of that is true, even if a small part of that is true, then it has huge implications for the kind of interventions we provide to the people with whom we work. Because, as we know, not all self-concepts are intact. Not all self-concepts are, in a sense, sort of healthy. Some have been fractured by things such as sexism and racism and ableism and heterosexism, the long list. And so we have to take that into consideration, as far as I'm concerned, relative to the career development intervention process. And we also know, and this is really important, obviously, for ongoing CPD, and that is the fact that who we are today might not necessarily be exactly who we are tomorrow, and so forth. And so the self-concept evolves over time, making choice and adjustment, continuous processes. I think we're always in between. It's a bit of a continuum. We're always in between knowing and not knowing in terms of our career development and our career choices. We never stay stagnant, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. Some people try to deny that, but I think that is the process. We're always in between knowing and not knowing relative to who we are and who we are becoming. And even if we didn't buy into that, we certainly know this from the last year, that not only does the self-concept evolve over time, making choice and adjustment continuous processes, the world of work evolves over time, making choosing and adjusting continuous requirements. So it's essential then, if both of those things are true, self-concept and the world of work evolving over time, we as practitioners clearly can't stay complacent, that we've got to keep looking at, considering, dealing with, addressing, engaging in discussion about how especially the world of work is evolving. And obviously right now there's great debate about things as simple yet complex as return to work. What does that look like? And what have we learned from the pandemic in terms of how work can happen and where it can happen, and what's important about both of those? And one of the things that struck me about the work that we do in the area of career development, and that is that we often attempt to treat it as if it's siloed. And we provide then interventions that reflect a life structure, how we structure the basic roles of living into a life that we find satisfying most of the time. We create interventions for a life structure that doesn't exist, which seems a bit bizarre to me. We all know that while busy making a living, we're busy living a life, and that our life roles intersect, sometimes in ways that are complementary, other times in ways that are conflictual. And so how do we address that? And what do our interventions have to say about that? And why don't we embrace that in our work with clients? And I think too often, and certainly it's true in the States, too often we compartmentalize and silo the work that we do as career development professionals. And then we expect people to go out and, okay, implement this choice in this larger life structure that you live. And so that has to be addressed. And one of the things that I've been focused on for about the last 15 years, along with my colleague Norm Amundsen from UBC in Canada, is this notion of hope. And if you look at our theories don't address hope at all. And yet, to me, hope is the fuel that drives engagement in career development. If we have no hope, why would we expect anyone who doesn't have a sense of hope for their future to actually engage with us in ways that we hope that they would? So hope to me is sort of central to all of the work that we do. And so I just kind of pose the question, in the work that you do, how are you focused on intentionally and explicitly helping your clients consider their situation in a more hopeful way, even in the most challenging situations? And we've used the hope action theory with very challenging populations with great success. And so it's just something to consider, I think, in terms of the work that we do. And this is sort of a made up level of service and training. It certainly applies in the States. And as I thought about it for our time together today, I thought, wow, there really are kind of like three levels of this. And the most basic level is this sort of information provision that we prepare people at a very minimal level to provide information to the people that they work with. A lot of times that's occupational and educational information. And those folks tend to have very little training. It's not that they don't need training, they do, but they tend to have very minimal training. And by the way, I'm not saying levels of importance, levels of service, and then the related training that goes with it. But I think in terms of CPD, we have to think about, so what are we providing to people that are sort of, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, paraprofessionals relative to their engagement and the career development work that they do and the services that they provide. There's also sort of a second level, in which people maybe have a bit more training and are a bit more involved in things such as basic assessment and helping people develop self-awareness, self-knowledge, and connect that to occupational and educational opportunities. And it tends to have a focus, levels 1 and 2, on career and decision. That is, help people get the information that they need, and they'll be able to proceed to make and then implement a career choice. And so there's that level. And then the third level, which is what I've been involved with in terms of the training that I've provided and the work that I've done, is really a level that carries with it a bit more advanced training, especially in the area of counseling for career development. And it's the area in which people can really help others deal with not only career indecision, but career indecisiveness. That is, the blocks that they experience relative to moving forward in their careers. It could be self-esteem, it could be pressure from family, it could be various contextual influences that shape their career development. And this has a bit of a psychological or counseling orientation to it relative to the career development process, because I think there really are a few things more personal than a career choice to a person, and that we know when career situations go awry, that a lot of negative fallout occurs in terms of abuse, both partner abuse, substance abuse, depression, suicide. A lot of negative things occur. So that's the place, I think, in which this sort of level of service can be provided. And I think, training for each of these levels is so essential. And we have our national associations, as has been mentioned, that help others move forward in their training related to this. I think one of the challenges, though, is that it's very difficult for folks to stay in their lane related to training and service that they provide. It's very quickly, I think, that when somebody is struggling with their career development, that it really moves into a level that requires somebody at that third level of training. And I will say in the States that I think, especially in the National Career Development Association, we have focused primarily on this level 1 and 2. I think we've largely, to our own detriment, ignored level 3 training and CPD for people at level 3. That others would disagree with me, perhaps. But having served as president of the National Career Development Association twice, my sense is that this is the challenge that we really face in the States, and that is the elevation of the professionalization. We've talked about that quite a bit. I think it's so important, and so important for the States in my context, is that we've got to look at ways to really translate, as Mary was saying, the work that we do into a profession to which we belong. And I think we struggle with that in the context in which I work. And all those levels are obviously important in terms of that kind of work. If we look at the things that clients have to tell us about what's important in the work that we do, this is some research that I've done. My initial work in the field, I ran a career development center for adults for 13 years as my part of my faculty role at the University of Virginia. And so we looked at what our clients had to tell us Often we ignore that, don't we? It's like, so I think we can learn best from our clients. And so we tried to do that. And we learned that when we give clients the opportunity to discuss work and non-work concerns in career intervention, guess what? They do. To a large percentage of time, they do. They don't see it as siloed. They see it as intersecting. And so I think we need to be prepared to provide service and interventions and training to people so that they can meet clients where they are and not expect them to come to where we are in terms of the training that we, or the intervention that we provide and the training that we provide to practitioners. And we ask clients, what's the most important thing that happened for you in career intervention? They will say, my career practitioner listened to me. My career practitioner supported me and provided me a safe space to ask any question I needed to ask about who I am and who I am becoming relative to my career development. And I think that's so important that then we provide training and a service that acknowledges that important, I think, fact. And so to me, a few essential competencies that we need to focus on in terms of CPD is helping people understand, how do you create an effective therapeutic alliance? How do you prepare people to not only address the objective element of career, which we've been so good at in terms of testing and telling and all that kind of stuff that's characterized our profession, I think, for its first 100 years. But I think more importantly, there's been this shift that's occurred from from objective to subjective, which really brings in the importance of cultural humility and cultural competence and sensitivity to that, embracing that ourselves as practitioners, and then being able to navigate that in terms of our work with clients who come to us from different cultural backgrounds. And the one that is so obvious that we've been doing so long is connecting clients to the services that they need. And then again, situating our career interventions not into a false sort of context, but into the context in which our clients live. So I think these are all challenges for CPD and providing training to people that I think we need to address. Shameless self-promotion here. My colleagues and I are doing this training in hope action theory and practice. We'll be doing one for our fantastic colleagues in Australia coming up, but it's open to anybody across the world. And if you're interested, I hope you will join us. And that's it. I'll stop there. I know we're running out of time.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. And I think if I've learned anything for the network going forward, we need to increase the amount of time we set for these webinars, because lots of questions coming through and not a lot of time to cover some of the detail. But I wonder if Mary and Siobhan would put their cameras on, and Spencer keep his camera on, and we can just have a little bit of time in the last moments to pick up on a few of the issues that you raised. And I'd like to ask each of you to respond to this question. How, from your perspective, do we actually speed up the process of professionalisation for career development practitioners, sort of from a global sense and from our own country, specific countries in which you operate sense? Mary, could I ask you to start? Sorry, it doesn't give you much time to think, but how do we speed up this process of professionalisation and gaining recognition?
Well, from my experience here in Australia, I'm not so sure that it's about speeding up as it is about doing things thoroughly, professionalising in a thorough way. And the things that we found in Australia was the importance of communicating with people about the value of professionalising and professional standards, and trying to have an inclusive process in that to bring people on board, to make them want to be part of the field. So I'm not sure it's about speeding up. I think it's about being thorough, knowing where we want to get to and how we can maximise the number of people who will come on that journey with us. So we have to be able to, I guess, explain what the benefits are of what we're doing. So I'll leave it there to give others a go.
Thank you. Siobhan, do you have a perspective?
Yeah, I agree with Mary. But I think I totally agree. It's about thoroughness, but it's also about multi-pronged approaches. I don't think you can do it in one way. I think we need to do it through policy and through engagement, getting government on side. But we also need to do it at grassroots level with practice and clients promoting the benefits that they've got. I think we too often hear, you know, the challenge of, well, the careers advisor didn't listen to me. So, you know, what Spencer was talking about was so important, really. And I think also about empowering practitioners and autonomy for practitioners. I think increasingly practitioners are being constrained by the funding regulations in which they're working in, which are deemed to better support clients, but I'd seriously question that. So I think it's multi-approaches.
Okay, and Spencer, anything you would add to that?
I simply would agree with Siobhan and Mary in terms of their important points related to that question. And I think we have a huge task ahead of us in terms of educating stakeholders about career intervention, what it's about, how complex it is, that in the States, this sort of historical notion of rugged individualism is just ridiculous in many respects. And this notion that you know, we all do it ourselves, which tends to characterize much of the thinking in the States, is ridiculous as well, that nobody makes it alone, and we all rely upon each other and need to collaborate and support. And that's especially true, I think, in terms of career intervention.
Thank you. And probably just one more question, because we are past the 10 o'clock mark, but it's you're such a rich expert, so I want to try and get another question in. So in terms of several people have talked about this morning, this issue of job titles and the multiplicity of job titles and roles out there. Have any of our speakers got any thoughts on what we should be trying to do about that in each of our countries to try and get more leverage or rationalize things out there? Any thoughts? Please just speak.
I think it's something we're looking at seriously in the UK, and I know David Morgan's already mentioned that in the chat. It is incredibly difficult because the philosophy of our government is about employers decide what they need. So, you know, how do you come along and challenge and say, well, no, this is the title you've got to use? You know, I think that is really, really difficult. I think what we need to have is, you know, what Spencer was talking about is greater clarity around the different activities and the types of roles that deliver those activities and what the training and qualifications are to do that. And I think if we can streamline that in partnership, in alliance with other parts of the sector, because you know, we're a very broad church, so trying to get an alignment across all of that is always going to be a challenge. But I think if there are ways that we can have a greater a clearer taxonomy in terms of roles and what people do and what those job titles might be, I think that would help.
Okay, Spencer, anything you'd like to add?
I love what Siobhan just said. I think it would be wonderful. And I think that's what this initiative, this conversation, I think, and the ones that follow are so important for our profession. And I certainly hope that we can keep it going. And I'd love to be able to participate in that. In the States, relative to this question, you know, in Virginia, there's a phrase, hot mess. It's not good. Let me just say that it's not good. And I think in terms of this whole question of titles and roles and identity, it's a hot mess in the States in terms of who we are, what we call ourselves, what that means in terms of what we do. Now imagine what the consumer has to sort through to try to figure it out.
Yeah. Perhaps that's a topic for future debate, and I'm really sorry to draw it to a conclusion here. And I do notice that about 20 people have joined the session in the last half hour or so. So I do apologise if the timings were sometimes somehow out. because we were running on GMT plus 1 hour, so that might have confused people, but I apologize. The recording will be, we will top and tail the recording through the CDI, make it available to all of the peak bodies who are part of the network, and then they will share it out with all of their members. Can I say thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for getting up early, staying up late, just about getting here after breakfast. Thank you very much for your contributions. It's been a really rich presentation. I'm just sorry we didn't have more time for discussion, but I think as we plan future events, and that's a note to Mary and I, we'll make sure we've got a bit of better time allocation to get more discussion in at the end. But thank you very much to our speakers and everybody who's taken part, and we will make the recording available to everybody. So thank you for your time, and have a good day or good night's sleep now, if that applies to you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.